Welcome back to Godless Reads, the Chilling Tales for Dark Night show where different godless authors read their own stories. I'm Drew Stepek, owner of Godless.com and the Godless app, and I'm also a horror author myself. I'm also the old creep who lives next door to you. On this week's show, our really good friend Mick Collins, who hails from Pennsylvania, reads his story, I Am the Gate. I Am the Gate is a story of this guy and his family who live next door to this creeped out old man in a small town. The creeped out old man, of course, will remind you of me. All the new Godless gear is coming to Godless real soon, like this bootleg motherfucking piece of shit. I don't know. That looks kind of rad, actually. But you can still pick up the old stuff. 3 t-shirts for $25. That's nuts. And like I said before, we're doing tons of giveaways on Godless.com and the Godless app. So go check that shit out. This week we're giving away 17 signed books, a hat signed by Al Jorgensen from Ministry, a Kindle, and tons of Godless shit. Do it! Special announcement. The second annual Godless 66 Awards are going to be broadcast here, live on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on June 6th, 2023 at 6 p.m.
Pacific Standard Time.
All right, y'all, kick back, grab your drug of choice, and let Mick Collins take you behind the gates of hell with his story, I Am the Gate. Gate.
I Am the Gate by Michael R. Collins. I lived next to Mr. Willard almost my entire life. In my parents' house, an early 20th century Foursquare, I grew up keeping a wary eye on him. He was always an old man. Even in my youth, he never changed, never got older. Same bushy white eyebrows, thick shock of wavy white hair, and that old man's stockiness. He said very little. I remember my father talking with him only a few times. My mother avoided him. He did nothing odd or untoward, but an overwhelming air of creepy unease surrounded him and his house. It had all the charm of a murder house. If I could pinpoint one thing that left me so uncomfortable, it was his impassive, unwavering stare, always on me and no one else. I assumed he might be some local perv and gave him wide berth. At night, I would peek through my bedroom window at his house, trying to solve his mystery, despite my fear of him. I swear I saw living shadows inside. In hindsight, what disturbed me the most about Mr. Willard and his house was the unknown. I've never really dealt well with what I couldn't predict. Dark rooms and heavy silences always send me into an anxiety attack. People loathe me at Christmas and birthdays because I get fidgety with wrapped gifts. I need to know what's in it. Otherwise, I break out in hives. Mr. Willard's house exemplified the antithesis of the unknown. He was the keeper of all that was mysterious, and it scared the shit out of me. When I moved away to college, leaving Mr. Willard behind came as a great relief. Until I came back. Years passed. I married, and we had a small daughter. My father passed away several years ago, and Mom couldn't keep up with the house. She moved into a more efficient place, and I moved my family into my childhood home. Mr. Willard's house looked no different. On previous visits home, he always stood on his porch and watched me. I waved hello, a polite gesture only, and he gave me his customary nod of the head. His house is always in shadow, my partner, Finley, said from the spare bedroom, lost in the mystery of Mr. Willard's house. Looking through the window of his place is like looking into darkness, but from the outside in. She shuddered, pulling curtains back, allowing us to be voyeurs. I never thought about it before, but you're right. It's like looking at the nighttime, but from a distance. I turned away from the window. Finley did too, running a hand through purple curls. Have you ever been in there, Thom? No, I answered, surprised at the idea. I never ventured inside. Not that I hadn't wondered what sort of living conditions the weird old man resided in. Usually neighbors invite each other over. Not this one. Maybe I could do the adult thing and go over, bridge the neighborly gap. "Ah!" Finley yelled. I spun around. Mr. Willard stood at his window, staring at us. Finley raised a tattooed arm and waved. He nodded at us, as is his custom, then turned to me. For the first time, I saw an expression on his face. My skin crawled and I grew cold. What the expression was, I couldn't say, because I was so unaccustomed to seeing him with one. To venture a guess, it was anticipation. A wail erupted from down the hall, breaking the spell. We rushed to see what had upset our daughter Christina, leaving Mr. Willard momentarily forgotten. Since moving back, Mr. Willard and I developed a routine. I worked evenings and got home around midnight. My job was nearby, and if the weather cooperated, I walked to and from work. Every night, Mr. Willard stood on his porch, in the dark, and watched me walk by. We gave obligatory head nods to each other. I unlocked my door and went inside. Every time I walked by, his house of shadows felt alive. Sometimes it looked as if the shadows swirled around him as he stood his silent vigil. This particular night clung to my skin like oily sweat. I couldn't wait to get inside my cool house, but there he stood, watching, waiting. I stopped at his front walk and made a split-second decision. For the first time in my life, I approached him on the porch. Maybe it was time to see what he was all about. "Good evening, Mr. Willard," I hailed him as I approached. "How are you tonight?" My words fell flat, as if I asked the most banal question of all time. He watched me as I approached, his silent countenance already making my skin itch. My chest tightened. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to talk to him, not in the middle of the night and not at his creepy house. But still I approached, already committed. "Thom." His deep voice resonated my name more than spoke it. "I have waited a long time for you to come to me. A long time indeed." With one foot on his creaking front step, the words stopped me in my tracks. This was not the start of a neighborly conversation. Not in my mind, anyway. "Well, I guess I've lived next to you since I was a kid. Never been to your house that whole time, which seems a little odd." I tried to make light of it with a little laugh, but the muggy air swallowed up my small attempt at humor. "I need your help with something, if you don't mind. Inside." A small smile crept across his face in an attempt at warmth. His eyes betrayed him. Sure. Now, or in the morning when there's more light?" I stammered. The thought of going in his house tightened my chest even more. "Please." He turned towards the door and grasped the handle. "It won't take long, and I am not able to do it myself." I couldn't move. My brain raced to come up with a polite excuse to postpone this until the sun came back up. "I cannot do this myself. I will need your help with it," he insisted. The sound of the doorknob echoed in my ears like a vast gateway opening. He pushed the door open to more darkness. No lights were on. I should be used to that, as I rarely remember light shining through the windows at night. No, there was one small glow of light coming from the back of the house, struggling to pierce the gloom. "In the basement," Mr. Willard explained. "It can't wait until morning." That statement broke my rigidity. Images of leaking water pipes or dying water heaters filled my head. Finley and I had recently tussled with both right after moving in. So this I could understand. Well, let's take a look then. I'll see what I can do. I stepped up on the porch. The pragmatism of helping an old man pushed away some of my fear. Some, but not all. I was still nervous as hell to go inside. I crossed the threshold and went clammy. Something was not right here, but I couldn't place why. In the darkened rooms, nothing seemed out of place from my expectations of an old man's home. Furniture sat as gray lumps and stale air hung thick. We passed a dining room that looked no different than any other. Why did it feel like a facade? The door to the basement sat next to the kitchen. Dull yellow light spilled from the stairway into the kitchen, which looked normal enough. What I expected to find, I wasn't sure, but my unease grew. One cupboard hung open, and from what I could see, it was empty. In fact, the kitchen looked unused. This way. Mr. Willard stood at the basement door, waiting. I took a breath and started down the steps. Panic shot through me again as the steps creaked under my weight. The thought of him pushing me down flashed through my mind. I gripped the wooden handrail so tight my knuckles went white. From below came a faint hissing and gurgling, which pulled me back from my fears some. Again, I'm just helping an old man with a leaky pipe. That's all. None of this unknown terror nonsense. At the bottom of the stairs, an odor wafted in the stale air, acrid and coppery. The basement steps ended at a closed door. Focusing on images of flooded floors behind it, I turned the clunky handle and swung it open. My muscles locked while my brain struggled to decipher the scene before me. The room beyond stretched out in odd angles. One section of the foundation wall had crumbled, but the hole was sealed with a pulsing pink membrane. Something large moved behind it. A thick, blue-black blob oozed from under a stained and battered wooden table. As if sensing my presence, it oozed towards me. From the table, a dark liquid dripped. I could smell blood. The shadows in the corner shone like black static, and something gurgled. I couldn't move or breathe. I became a pillar of fear and sensory overload. Thom, I've been waiting for a long time, watching over you, knowing the time would come when you would come to fulfill the cycle, Mr. Willard said from behind me. His words broke my petrification, and I turned. To my horror, I realized I was in the heart of the basement. I didn't remember even leaving the bottom step, let alone walking to the center of this demented room. The ooze was nearly at my feet. I leapt away. Mr. Willard stood at the doorway, blocking my only exit. The thing behind the membrane continued to roil. What are you talking about? What is this? The beginning. The end, he said, explaining nothing. At this point, I didn't care. If I had to go through him to get out of here, I would. Old man or not. Move! I yelled as I charged him. He laughed a mirthless laugh. His eyes rolled back, revealing only the whites, and his stocky face sallowed, the cheeks pulling in. The body emaciated, and his fingers stretched in long, spidery claws as his skin turned a reddish gray. I tried to stop, horrified by the transformation, but my momentum wouldn't allow it. I crashed into him, and his clawed hands raked down my back. I threw him aside and bounded up the stairs. One of the ancient wooden steps gave way. I pulled my foot up, and below, dozens of eyes blinked up at me. At the top of the stairs, I readied to sprint for the front door. My stomach sank. Everything changed. This wasn't the same house I just walked through. The rooms distorted. Passageways led to faraway chambers. A wooden archway leading to a marbled hall replaced the front door. Everything was dark, with things skittering around in it. Behind me, I heard Mr. Willard, or whatever the hell he was, climbing the stairs. Only the dining room I passed when I first entered this hell house remained recognizable. I lurched towards it, desperate for any hint of escape from this madness. I bounded around a simple wooden table and 4 straight-backed chairs. As I neared a small table in the corner, it hissed at me. Something hidden under it coiled in anticipation to strike. I stepped away and turned around. Mr. Willard stood watching from the doorway of the basement, his eyes still white as his form continued to change. Now his thin frame draped in a large cloak, things writhed underneath it. Time to complete the last step. Time to fulfill your function. You are the gate. His deep voice caused something behind him to leap from shadow to shadow. The words shocked me because I knew he was right, though I still didn't understand what he was talking about. They awakened an unfamiliar feeling, thoughts unthought but welcomed like a forgotten friend. I had to focus on escape. I struggled to hold it together. Behind me stood a closed door, and I prayed it led to some other room as I yanked it open. Dozens of black and red hands reached out for me, hungrily grabbing and pulling. I broke free and turned. Mr. Willard had gone, but where? I left the dining room and ran towards the archway that used to be the front door. The room was made of stone columns and gray stucco. Through the arch, I saw the marble floor leading to a curtain of inky blackness. Something about that darkness seemed wrong, as if I knew crossing it would undo everything I had ever been. Another archway to my left led to a room that appeared to be jumbles of stacked furniture. Something nearby said. I looked up in the opposite corner. A creature, its skin taut against its T-shaped head, turned towards me with shining eyes. Its stick-thin body nestled in the top corner of the room, its head resting against the ceiling. Its spindly legs hovered above the floor with arms along the ceiling. Bat-like hands twitched. I bolted into the room of furniture. The room rose to a cavernous height with giant piles of chairs, tables, cabinets, and who knew what else tottering above me. It seemed to go on forever. A narrow path led straight through to another doorway. I sped towards it. Something ran with me, hidden in the rows. I could hear the ticking of multiple feet. I pushed myself to go faster as I neared the room's exit. Whatever raced me knew this place better than I, as it found an intersection to cut me off. The pursuer resembled a cross between large intestines and a centipede, with long, searching antennae and sharp little legs. Long, thick veins pulsed on its pink-gray skin as it moved. As soon as it crossed over, I ran past, but it must have anticipated me. One of the twitching antennae brushed my leg. A searing pain caused me to stumble into the next room. I entered a musty collection of narrow wooden shelving, a canning cellar for the damned and dismembered. On it sat random body parts, jars that contained swirling and frothing liquids. In one sat a head. It blinked as I passed. Another had a hand pawing at the glass. These body parts were alive in the jars. How? What would one possibly do to deserve such a torture? I exited into a bedroom. The walls were splattered black. The shredded bed was covered in blood. Holes in the walls and splintered furniture told a story of unimaginable violence. The overpowering stench of rot and decay caused me to gag. My stomach lurched again as I realized I stood in my own bedroom, or rather, a mere image of it. Whose blood was this? Why is this room here? Oh God, Finley and Christina! I fled the room praying this was all just a horrible hallucination. Instead of re-entering the canning room, I skidded to a halt in a kitchen. The same kitchen I passed before entering the basement. At the stove stood a person naked and sagging, their lumpy gray skin covered in discolored patches, gender undeterminable. They held a pan over a hot stove burner, cooking something foul. The odor made my eyes water. They turned towards me with a toothless grin and empty eye sockets. Bending way over to turn up the heat, one of the long, fleshy breasts fell into the pan. It sizzled and burned. The smell of charring flesh filled the room. Still they looked at me, drool falling from their grinning mouth. "This is the beginning." Mr. Willard's disembodied voice boomed through the air. "All things must come to pass, and pass they shall. You are the gate." Before I had a chance to understand what he meant, or why the shock of truth ripped through me like it did, the cook pulled their breast out of the pan and lifted the pan to their lips, tipping the contents into their open mouth. The brackish sludge filled their hungry maw and spilled over their face. Once it was empty, they let the pan clang to the floor and tensed before releasing an immense fart. The rancid stench reminded me of the last bowel movement of the dead. Then they did it again with a long, thundering, unending crescendo. First, their flabby stomach collapsed inward. Then they bent down and shrunk into themselves. The fart gained substance and shit splattered against the opposite counters. More than shit sprayed as they continued to collapse inward. They were shitting their entire self, I realized. I couldn't take this anymore. I turned, but in the doorway behind me, something tall and oily loomed. Dressed in green and black ooze, bloody eyes stared at me hungrily. I turned to find one last gooey toot, and the old person was gone. The only remnants were the splattering of excrement, blood, and offal that painted the walls and counters. I jumped it and missed, my heel catching the edge of the slime, causing me to slip. I grabbed the counter to stop my fall, but it was too slick with the fluvium, and I fell back into the fetid mess. It smelled of rotten vegetable matter, decayed meat, and dead things. I crawled on hands and knees until I was out of the glop, and stood, trying to ignore the filth that covered me. My feet slipped as I exited the kitchen, almost relieved as I approached the soft glow of the basement light. I chanced to look and saw the ooze had made it to the bottom of the steps. To my right lay a small hallway. With trepidation, I went for it. There had to be a way out of this madness, away from this growing sensation of something inside me trying to open. I approached the hall carefully. There were 2 doors on the right, 1 on the left. Doors were not to be trusted here. I prayed to find a window behind at least one of them. I had yet to encounter any since this insanity started. If I could find one, I might escape. Something moved behind me. No choice but forward, I stepped up to the door on the left. As I did, the hallway expanded and stretched to infinity, an endless amount of doors in front of me. Hope, or the slightest spark of it, sputtered. Left with few options, or in this case too many, I pulled open the first door and stepped in. The room was as dark as the rest of the house, but full of chittering. The far wall shook with a kinetic frenzy of movement. I didn't wait to find out and stepped out, slamming the door. As I did, the sound of hundreds of insect wings and the scurry of just as many rodent feet erupted behind it. I heard the familiar clicking sounds of a multitude of feet. I spun around, and the massive intestinal centipede reared up and slammed into me, knocking my breath out. I flew down the hall from the impact and landed on the floor. The nightmare creature fell to the ground and raced towards me. Still breathless, I scrambled to my feet and grasped the nearest doorknob. I flung myself inside the room and shut the door, leaning against it as the beast scratched at it in a fury. The room was still and dark, unnerving me as I waited for the next horror to appear. "What is this place?" I sobbed, still trying to recapture my stolen breath. "How can any of this be real?" My voice echoed for a long time. The room was vast, as large as an amphitheater. Pulling away from the door, I ventured a few steps, and nothing happened. It seemed I was alone. Cautious relief dared an approach. The brief thought of just staying in this room occurred to me, but what good would it do? Surrounded by all this horror, safety here is tentative, if at all. I had to find a way out, a way back to reality. Ahead, a faint red light grew from a far right corner. A small hum vibrated the floor. The creature still scratched maddeningly at the door as the light grew brighter, and I realized the far end of the space was a tunnel of some sort, running the width of the room. Like a train platform from the bowels of a nightmare. The left exit to the tunnel remained pitch black, resisting the coming of the red light that grew brighter and brighter. The light shifted and moved as if something were dancing in front of it. I backed up, dreading what approached. The hum grew to a deafening din and shook everything. The light increased, and the source of the shadows would appear any second. Oh God, what dreaded thing now? The thing emerged. It appeared to be a man, his step careful, and his arms waving as if feeling the air. He dressed in plain work clothes. His unkempt, scraggy hair bobbed as he moved. He turned towards me with eyes dancing around in their sockets. He bled from his ears in thick rivulets. Whatever approached in the tunnel cared little about the man standing in its way as it thundered towards him. In the blink of an eye, the behemoth sped into sight, the size of a train. The head was all mouth with razor-sharp scythe teeth and rotating tusks. It might as well have been a living wheat thresher. It plowed through the man, cutting through him as if he were never there. The pureed soup of him sprayed in all directions. I couldn't get away in time before it covered me head to toe. The massive locomotive beast sped to the other side of the tunnel, and as it pierced the darkness, its thick red skin peeled back. The black veil skinned it and pushed its innards back so that when the end came into sight, the foul guts spread across the floor. The light had gone out. The humming and vibrating stopped. Only I remained standing there, covered in blood, guts, and foul shit. The creature at the door still continued its attempts at entry. Come this way. There is no need to run any longer. As you can see, it will do no good. I jumped at the sound of Mr. Willard's deep voice. How did I have any surprise left in me? He stood in a doorway cut from the wall, leading out to the arched front room. Mr. Willard's transformation now looked complete. His head now bald, his skin a dark maroon gray, his white eyes almost bug-like. His thin face held no creases or wrinkles anymore. Something continued to move under his drape. I hesitated, and Mr. Willard repeated the request. Left with no other choice, I followed with heavy footsteps. You are the gate, Mr. Willard said once we made it to the middle of the room. I don't know what that means! My sanity and resolve were at an end. I just want to go home. What is this nightmare? Is this hell? Hell? No. He scoffed at the idea. No. This is what lives in the dark, just along the edges of what you can't quite see. There is a place between the unknown and the known. Every irrational fear is because of the sliver of existence that lies between the two. A dark room is just a dark room, but between the dark room and the light switch is this. Every time you fear a secret, this place lives in the seconds before the answer is whispered in your ear. He paused, letting his words sink in. You are the gate. Stop saying that! I screamed at him. Tears streaked the muck on my face. I hated the sound of the word as it came from his thin lips. I hated it because somehow I knew it was true, and it confused me even more. A person cannot be an opening. We stood in the front of the archway with the marble floor in the inky black. This is the way out, isn't it? Isn't it? It is! I'm going home! I was a blubbering mess now. I bounded down the hall, every nerve in my body telling me to stop. Every neuron in my brain, even my very soul, screamed for me not to breach this last unknown. Through panic-driven will, I plowed through, tripping over my own feet as I reached the other side. I fell, scraping my face and hands against rough carpet. Raising my head, I cried out. I was back in the front room of the old man's house. It looked just as it did when I first walked through. Regular furniture, the slivers of streetlight stabbing through the windows, and the hint of humid night air. I got to my knees and I looked over my shoulder. No arches or maddening geography, just a house in the dark. But then I heard the skittering of the centipede creature as it ran into another room. In the top corner, the thin, stick-like man loomed and watched, sucking at his teeth. Standing at the front door, Mr. Willard stared down at me. It's time. He pulled the cloak and flung it away. His body comprised of hundreds of hands. Some sat patient, others greedy, while some made gestures I couldn't even guess at. You are the gate, Thom. It's time you realized, because it's time to open up. Still on my knees, I slumped, knowing this Willard thing was right. I had no hope of escape and no energy left to fight the feeling. I have been here this whole time, watching you and waiting. That's why I have always been your neighbor. I had to watch over the gate. His hands, all of them, reached for me. Please, open up. I could deny it no longer. I was the gate, and it was a lie to think anything else. My lifelong fears weren't driven by dark corners and unopened boxes, but of what I closed off. I felt them inside me. Not actually inside me, but the other side of me. The unknown wanted out. I was holding back a vast forever, and all its inhabitants were impatient and ready to flow through me. All I had to do was open up and let it all out. To be what I feared the most. Mr. Willard approached and put one of his dry hands on my moist forehead. At the touch, I unlocked myself. My skin split down the middle and ribs spread apart. My bones stretched and reshaped. I grew and widened, becoming the threshold. A new doorway came to be in the room, and it was me. Claws, fingers, and other appendages grasped my sides as the first few ventured out of the opening. The winds and stillnesses wafted out with them. I spread and spread until I was no longer a man, but the doorway. Mr. Willard opened his front door as the dread multitudes flowed out into the unsuspecting night.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.